So enjoyable. Really never had something this bad with everything together.
Did you hear Max Verstappen's radio transmission during the Chinese Grand Prix sprint qualifying session? Because it wasn't just a simple complaint. It was a statement that exposed a much bigger problem within Red Bull. Max literally said that the downshifts were terrible and that the car had no grip or balance. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are we just seeing a bad Friday, or the first serious symptom that Red Bull is no longer the dominant team? And now for the key question. What's really going on inside the RB22 that led Verstappen to say on the radio that the day was a disaster? Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In this video, we're going to analyze exactly what happened during the Chinese Grand Prix sprint qualifying session, why Verstappen's radio transmission was so emphatic, and what it really reveals about Red Bull's current situation in this new technical era of Formula One. Because what we heard on that radio wasn't just frustration. It's a very clear clue about the car's true condition. It was a week where everything should have been relatively predictable for a champion like Max Verstappen. However, from the very first minutes of the session, it was already becoming clear that something wasn't right. As the track evolved and lap times began to drop lap after lap, the RB22 wasn't responding as expected. Other teams were improving with each attempt, but the Red Bull car seemed to be stuck in a rut. What initially seemed like a complicated Friday quickly turned into a much more worrying scenario for the Milton Keynes team. As the session progressed, the on-track benchmark began to shift. Mercedes surprised everyone by locking out the front row with Russell and Antonelli, while McLaren and Ferrari also showed very strong pace. In that context, Verstappen was relegated to positions that don't reflect the standard he's set in recent years. Finishing 8th for the sprint grid wasn't just a disappointing result for the world champion, but also a sign that the competitive balance of the grid might be shifting. For a driver who normally fights for pole in every session, finding himself in the middle of the leading group was already a clear anomaly. But the real moment that set off alarm bells wasn't the final result, but what was heard over the radio during his lap. Verstappen told his engineer that the downshifts were terrible, something that to the casual observer might sound like a simple driving issue, but which actually points to a much deeper technical problem. When a Formula One driver mentions downshifting issues, they're talking about braking stability, the behavior of the hybrid system, and how the engine and gearbox interact at the most critical moment of each corner. On a circuit like Shanghai, where several long corners demand absolute precision on entry, this type of problem can cost valuable tenths of a second in every sector. This complaint was compounded by an even more revealing one. Verstappen stated that the car lacked grip and balance, and that they were losing massive amounts of time in the corners. This combination of symptoms points directly to the RB22 not operating within its ideal aerodynamic window. After that radio broadcast, the analysis within the paddock began immediately. When a driver like Verstappen describes such specific problems during qualifying, engineers and technical analysts don't interpret it as mere frustration. They take it as a direct clue as to where the car might be failing. In this case, the combination of comments Max made was particularly revealing. He spoke of problematic downshifts, a lack of grip, and a car losing significant amounts of time in the corners, which ignited a debate among journalists and engineers about the actual integration of Red Bull's new technical package in this era of the 2026 regulations. The most talked about rumors in the paddock point to one very specific issue. The new engine developed by Red Bull in conjunction with Ford might still be in a maturation phase. Building a completely new power unit always involves risks, and Formula One history is full of examples where even established manufacturers took several seasons to reach their peak performance. In Red Bull's case, the challenge is even greater because it's not just about the engine itself. There's also the complex interplay between the hybrid system, the electronic energy management, and the new active aerodynamics defined by these regulations. When any of these elements isn't perfectly calibrated, the driver feels it immediately on the track. From there, the most interesting technical indicators emerge. When Verstappen mentions that the car is losing a lot of time in the corners, the engineers immediately look at three factors. First, braking stability, which depends largely on how the engine and hybrid system manage engine braking during downshifts. Second, aerodynamic balance, especially in long corners like the famous Shanghai corner, where the car must maintain constant downforce for several seconds. And third, energy management under acceleration, because if the hybrid system doesn't deliver power at the right moment, the car loses speed just as the driver tries to exit the corner with maximum traction. Given Verstappen's direct radio statement in Shanghai, attention quickly shifted to the team's internal reaction. However, at the start of this technical cycle, the narrative has changed slightly. Within the team, it's now acknowledged that current performance isn't at the level of previous seasons. This doesn't mean the project is in crisis, but it does reflect that the new regulations have placed all teams in a learning phase where even the most dominant structures must rebuild their advantage step by step. The key figure in this context is Laurent Mekies, who has had to manage the team's public discourse during a delicate time. His statements have been clear and quite realistic by Formula One standards. He has admitted that Red Bull is not currently the benchmark on the grid and that Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren appear to be a step ahead in terms of pure pace. This type of public acknowledgement is unusual for a team that had dominated for years, but it also reveals a communication strategy aimed at reducing immediate pressure while the team continues to understand the RB22's true on-track behavior. From Verstappen's perspective, the situation is also interesting. Max has never been a driver who hides his feelings about the car. His radio communication style has always been extremely direct, something that within Red Bull is interpreted more as a working tool than as destructive criticism. When Verstappen describes the car as lacking grip and balance, the engineers analyze it as valuable information to accelerate the development process. In fact, much of the team's historical success has been linked precisely to this dynamic between a very demanding driver and a technical team capable of reacting quickly to that feedback. When a driver of Verstappen's caliber starts expressing frustration, so visibly in the early races of a new technical era, it inevitably increases the internal pressure to find quick solutions. When a team loses that initial qualifying advantage, the entire dynamic of the weekend changes. The driver is forced to fight in traffic, manage tire wear more carefully, and take greater risks when overtaking. And in a championship where several tenths of a second separate the leading teams, each of these variables can make the difference between winning a race and finishing off the podium. The second consequence relates to the competitive balance of the championship. If Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren have truly entered the new technical era with a more solid understanding of the regulations, the season could become a much more open battle than many anticipated. During the previous era, Verstappen often had enough margin to manage races even when something wasn't perfect. But in a scenario where four teams perform similarly, every small technical issue is magnified. A car that loses grip in long corners or doesn't manage the hybrid power correctly can lose tenths of a second in every sector, and those tenths quickly translate into several grid positions. There is also a strategic consequence for Red Bull as an organization. When a dominant team enters a new technical cycle without the initial advantage it expected, it is forced to make more aggressive decisions regarding car development. This means introducing upgrades ahead of schedule, accelerating wind tunnel testing, and dedicating more resources to resolving integration issues between the engine, aerodynamics, and electronic systems. This type of reaction can produce significant performance gains if the diagnosis is correct, but it also carries risks because every major change to the car's design needs time to be validated on the track. Despite Verstappen's harsh radio comments and the sprint qualifying result, few within Formula One believe Red Bull will remain in a secondary position for long. Historically, the Milton Keynes-based team has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to react when it identifies a technical issue. What might take other teams several races to analyze, Red Bull typically translates into concrete improvements in a relatively short period. Therefore, while Friday in Shanghai revealed an unusual vulnerability, it could also become the starting point for a very aggressive development phase during the upcoming races. The team's first immediate objective will be to understand exactly why the RB22 isn't operating within its ideal performance window. In a modern Formula One car, the final on-track behavior depends on an extremely delicate combination of aerodynamics, suspension, engine mapping, and hybrid system management. When Verstappen speaks of a lack of grip and problematic downshifts, the engineers aren't just looking at a single isolated component. They analyze thousands of data points from telemetry, simulators, and the wind tunnel to understand if the problem lies in how the car generates downforce, how the engine delivers power, or how both systems interact in each phase of the corner. It's also important to remember that the sprint format provides teams with an extremely valuable amount of information in a very short time. Each lap allows them to observe how the car performs with different fuel levels, engine modes, and tire degradation patterns. For Red Bull, the Chinese Grand Prix weekend can function almost as a laboratory under real racing conditions. Every adjustment to the engine map, every change in power distribution, and every modification to the aerodynamic setup can help bring the car closer to the performance window Verstappen needs to exploit his driving style. If we piece together what happened in the Chinese Grand Prix sprint qualifying session, Verstappen's radio transmission ceases to be a simple moment of frustration and becomes a very clear indication of the current situation at Red Bull. A car that can't find grip, problems with downshifts, and a driver who feels he's losing significant amounts of time in the corners paint a picture the team hasn't experienced in several years. During the previous cycle, their dominance was so solid that even difficult weekends ended in comfortable victories or podium finishes. But in this new technical era, every small imbalance in the car is immediately amplified against rivals who now seem to have started the new regulations with a more stable foundation. At the same time, this situation also confirms something many Formula One engineers anticipated before the season even began. The new regulations were going to completely reshape the competitive order of the grid. When engines, aerodynamics, and hybrid systems change so radically, even the most dominant teams need time to rebuild their advantage. What we're seeing in China could be precisely that transition period where Red Bull is trying to understand the true limits of its new technical project while Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren seize every opportunity to close the gap at the front of the championship. However, it would be a mistake to interpret this moment as a definitive sign about the season's outcome. Red Bull remains one of the most efficient organizations in Formula One when it comes to technical development. Over the past few years, it has demonstrated its ability to quickly transform driver feedback into concrete car improvements. And Verstappen, with his ability to detect every detail of the car's behavior, remains one of the most powerful tools the team has to accelerate that evolutionary process. Therefore, what today appears to be a weakness could also become the starting point for the next major improvement of the RB22. The real question is how long it will take Red Bull to find that solution. Because if the team manages to correct the car's balance and optimize the integration of the engine with the active aerodynamics, Verstappen will immediately be back in the fight for pole positions and victories. But if these problems persist for several races, the season could become one of the most open and strategically complex Formula One has seen in years. Now I want to know your opinion. Do you think Red Bull will resolve these issues quickly? Or are we witnessing the start of a season where Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren can truly challenge Verstappen? Leave your analysis in the comments. And if you're interested in understanding Formula One from a technical and strategic perspective, subscribe so you don't miss the next analyses.